oh, our organization might be having a meeting problem. My mission is that the first software they think about is Fellow. Spend time and resources on thought leadership and on content creation, because as we know, this will nurture that 95% of people that aren't ready to buy your product just yet.
What are those content formats that you're using for the 95% playbook?
We want to be everywhere that a customer is searching for a software like ours. But that 95% is more on that demand creation. We do it through channels like the podcast, the newsletter, ebooks, webinars. I think all of this together creates this trust in people that in the future will think about you when they want a solution.
What is the one out of those that you've seen as like, this is actually having the biggest impact that we can see from user acquisition, customer acquisition standpoint?
I will say the podcast has been huge. I see the podcast as one of our big rock content pieces. I also like to think of it as a Trojan horse, like the center of a lot of things. Since we started posting podcast clips on our LinkedIn account, our following has increased by 30%.
Written content is easy to replicate, but these insights you're getting from expert-led conversations, you can't replicate those from like an AI prompt.
Fellow is in a very competitive environment. I think now more than ever, founder-led marketing is becoming super important.
How do you continue to know that this is something to continue to invest in?
One thing that has been a big learning for us at Fellow is
all right, Manuela, thank you for being here today.
Eric, thank you for having me. This is so exciting. What an honor to be a guest on your show.
Yeah, thank you. We've known each other for a little bit now. We've worked together a bit. I'm a huge fan of what you and the team are doing at Fellow in terms of your marketing, your content, all of that. That's why I thought we could have a great chat today. So for those listening, just a recap, like the goal of this show is to identify the ways you can reach the 95% of the market that is not actively buying right now through content. And, traditionally, most companies, most teams of years past have focused and fought over the 5% that are in market and actively searching out a solution. And so what we want to uncover now is what are the ways we can use social and content platforms, podcasting, YouTube, LinkedIn, TikTok, newsletters, all of those things to stay top of mind with buyers so that when they do move into a buying motion, you're on that short list. And I know you and the team at Fellow think a lot about that. And
100%.
Yeah. And
yeah, so it's my mission at Fellow, Eric, as you were saying, to make sure that when people think about, oh, our organization might be having a meeting problem, too many meetings right now. Should we find a solution to help us with this? My mission is that the first software they think about is Fellow. But I am very conscious, and I think everyone at the company is very conscious that this takes time. So I'm really excited to chat with you about what it takes, right, for a marketing team to invest in these like long-term content initiatives, knowing that some of them might not have an immediate ROI. And I think as marketers, we need to know that that is okay.
Preach. And yeah, by way of a little background, just so everybody has context. So right now you're the head of marketing at Fellow. If you want to maybe just give a 1 or 2 minute overview of Fellow and your role there, and then we can kind of dive into your playbook.
I joined Fellow almost 6 years ago now as the first marketing hire. So I joined when the company was only made up of 5 other employees, like counting the 3 founders, and all of them were coders or developers. So I joined the CEO as the first non-technical hire, and I was basically Aiden, who's our CEO. I was Aiden's right hand at the beginning of everything, right? Like we were talking to customers via intercom together. Like I was doing a bit of customer support, but I was originally hired as the first marketer, which meant I helped Aiden write the copy for the first website. Aiden and I together built our first Google Ads campaigns. We launched the product behind a wait list. We announced it on Product Hunt very early on. So it's been a really fun ride because I was there for like the very beginning of everything when we didn't didn't even have a website, when people didn't know we existed. And now Fellow, as you know, is like a very like solid product that organizations across the world are using. We have some really well-renowned customers like Shopify, teams at companies like HubSpot, like a lot of companies that are using Fellow. And that is so exciting for me to see, because I was here even before we had a website.
And that context is great too from a marketing standpoint, because you've probably experimented with quite a bit over that time. You've created strategies and then kind of got those motions down, and then maybe built the foundation to the next one. So we can kind of go through that, and what that looked like for you, and maybe to set a little bit of context for what your 95% sort of content playbook is how would you, what is the breakdown right now, I guess, percentage wise, or however you look at this, between, the revenue that's generated for Fellow, between like marketing led activities or like sales led activities? Is there like a breakdown you can share for that?
For sure. So Fellow is a product that has a PLG motion. So I will give our growth team a lot of credit for how we acquire new users into the product, because I do think that the product has a very strong, like influence and responsibility there. Fellow is a very viral product that gets a lot of word of mouth as well, like from company to company. But apart from that, our motion is fully inbound. At the moment, we don't do any kind of outbound. I'm sure we will start doing some in the near future. But for like from the beginning of Fellow's history until now, like 6 years later, everything has been inbound. And I've been responsible for that, obviously, with the help of everyone on the marketing team, to bring in those new users through content, through programs that you know very well, like our podcast, our newsletter. So I think that one thing that I wanted to say, Eric, just going back to the story of when I joined Fellow, is I think it was very important that from the beginning, Aiden, who is the CEO of Fellow, knew that he wanted to position Fellow as a thought leader when it came to meetings and management. Because we know that managers, people managers, are the employees or the people that have the most meetings, right? Like when you start to manage teams, that's when you start to see your calendar go crazy. So to go back to the thought leadership conversation, I really appreciate that I joined a company where the CEO from the beginning hired me saying, hey, we need to become thought leaders in this space. And this is going to take time. And this is going to take a lot of content. And for the listeners, Eric, and I don't know if you knew this, I have a background in journalism. So that's why Aiden made the decision to hire a journalist as his first marketing hire, because I think he, from the beginning, wanted to make this bet that content was going to be really important to position Fellow as a thought leader in the space. So I think it all originates as well from like the CEO understanding that this is a long-term play.
And 6 years ago, I mean, 2018, like, 2018, 2019, like that was a much rarer type of forward thinking, strategy. I mean, there were still companies, of course, using content, but in the way that you're describing for thought leadership, it was a little bit more rare. And so, yeah, kind of actually leading right to this question would be within your inbound. So everything is either, PLG, product-led growth, word of mouth based on, how valuable and compelling the product is. And then also inbound. So everything being inbound. Within the inbound, is there a breakdown of how you're attracting those new users and customers in the 5% who are bottom of funnel searching keywords in, search engines or things like that? They're actively seeking out a solution similar to yours, and how you're showing up, versus like the 95% who are not, but those are the places where you can build that affinity with them before they're ready to buy. Like, how do you think about the split between those two?
When I think about that split, I think about, let's start with the 5%, right? So we want to be everywhere that a customer is searching for a software like ours. So that is like the bottom funnel keywords, bottom of funnel content, right? Like when someone searches for meeting agenda software, or if someone listening to this works at a perhaps CRM system, right? Like you want to show up for those keywords when they are sure that they want to buy a product like yours. So for that, we obviously use Google Organic and Google Paid, which has been like a very like equal split for acquisition. So that I like to think about as demand capture. I don't know if like you've seen this term. I've been seeing it going around on LinkedIn a lot, like the difference between demand capture and demand generation or demand creation. So I think of that 5% as capturing existing demand, like who is typing and searching for these things. Let's capture them with organic and paid content on Google, search engines like Google. But that 95% that you're talking about and that I think this podcast is focused on is more on that demand creation. And actually today, Eric, I think it was super relevant. I saw a LinkedIn post saying that we shouldn't call it demand generation, but demand earning or earn demand.
Earn demand. Yeah.
Like you earn that demand, like you earn that trust, right? Like because you've been putting out so much great content over the years. We do it through channels like the podcast, the newsletter, that ebooks, for example, as well, and webinars. I think all of this together creates this trust in people that in the future will think about you when they want a solution. So I wanted to bring this up because I like that concept of earning the demand.
Agreed. I feel the same way about owned audience or owned media, like that term, which I think it's very relevant for, marketing to the 95%, but you don't own the audience. Like you earn the audience every single week. Just because they subscribe to your newsletter or subscribe to your podcast doesn't mean you own that, even if there's no algorithm in between you and them. They have to continue to opt into wanting to consume your content. And that's something that you earn by repeatedly giving, high quality, high value content. So yeah, I agree. I really love the term like earned for all of this, honestly.
Earning. Yeah. Like earning trust, earning that demand when they eventually think they need a solution like yours. So that's what we're trying to do with all the content we put out.
Yeah, so let's go through that a little bit. You started listing off some of those channels, some of those content formats. If you could give us like an overview of what are those channels, what are those content formats that you're using for the 95% playbook, and then we can maybe go into some details about them. But first that overview, maybe.
Yeah, I can't talk about our podcast without giving you guys at Hatch a huge shout out. We've been working together for a few years to produce it. And I see the podcast as one of our big rock content pieces, right? Like I also like to think of it as a Trojan horse. I don't know, it's like the center of a lot of things that then get produced thanks to the podcast. So our podcast is called Super Managers. I was telling you earlier that we know that the core or most active users of our product are managers, people who lead a lot of people and teams because they're in a lot of meetings. So that's why the strategic decision was made to call it Super Managers and to target this audience. And yeah, we have guests from like very well-known companies. We've had the CTO of IBM, the CTO of Zoom, the president of Shopify on the podcast, a lot of great guests. But that podcast is the center of a lot of initiatives, like our newsletter, right? Like out of the podcast, we write a newsletter that we send out to our list of subscribers with other fellow related content that perhaps we write on the website. So those are like the podcast, the newsletter. And most recently, we've also started a motion to have a monthly thought leadership event or roundtable, which is what we want to call it. So events around themes that our customers and people in our ICP are experiencing. Like, for example, one common one that we just had is meeting bloat or having too many meetings in an organization. And how do you tackle that? So those are three that come to mind, Eric. And I will say the podcast has been huge. And of course, I'm missing social here. But again, I think everything we post on social stems from those other core pieces of content, like the podcast and the roundtables. So I wanted to tell you, I recently checked our LinkedIn stats, and since we started posting podcast clips created by Hatch, by the way, on our LinkedIn account, our following has increased by 30%. And we know that LinkedIn is a channel where our ICP, like leaders in organizations, operations leaders, that's where they hang out most of the time. So we care a lot about this channel, and it's awesome to see that our podcast content being shared as clips is helping us talk to this audience on LinkedIn and continue to build that trust. So
Amazing.
super, super exciting to see.
Amazing. Yeah, I love that breakdown, and using it as the pillar piece that then can fuel those other pieces that you mentioned. And one thing I think is important to note is that Aiden is the host of the
Yes,
podcast.
the CEO of the company.
CEO of the company is the host of the podcast. He's a domain expert in the field, highly credible in the space, and champions the brand as the face of the brand, in a individuals personality based way, more so than like individuals over institutions, is like something I think is like really going to be a powerful thing in the future. And Aiden, deciding and choosing to dedicate time to this, whereas other CEOs think they don't have enough time for something like this. It sounds to me like Aiden has been bought in for the last, I mean, even when you started 6 years ago, that like,
From when
we
I started,
have to do this.
Yes, I know, Eric, you are friends with Dave Gerhardt, but he has this saying that I love, which is life is too short to work for a CEO that doesn't get marketing. and and I love repeating that because I think, yeah, as marketers, like even for people listening to this podcast, like if you're ever considering switching jobs or looking for a new company, make sure that the CEO understands marketing in the sense that they are willing to make these bets, right? They're willing to spend time and resources on thought leadership and on content creation, because as we know, and what this podcast I know is about, this will nurture that 95% of people that aren't ready to buy your product just yet.
Totally. And out of those three, or four really, including social, is there one that you would say, so the podcast is of course like the pillar, but each channel has its own in-platform success, or might actually have a higher weighting of like what you see on, attribution with self-reported attribution, or what you see on, acquiring new users, even though the podcast is the pillar, maybe LinkedIn is the number one channel or what have you. Like, so what is the one out of those that you've seen as like, this is actually having the biggest impact that we can see, from user acquisition, customer acquisition standpoint, or how do you think about that in general? Like,
yeah, we definitely see a lot more customer acquisition on our organic Google channel than, for example, LinkedIn or directly from the podcast. But Eric, the way we're using these other content pieces is by adding quotes and information from all these content pieces into our Google organic content, right? Like the blogs we produce on our website, for example. So I would attribute a lot of the success of the blog to other pieces of content like the podcast and the webinars, because that is where we get a lot of quotes and like relevant information from, and how we build trust with our blog readers. The newsletter has also been a channel for customer acquisition, because I think it not only allows us to distribute the podcast content, but it allows us to include some product CTAs or plugs to check out new features in the product. So that is also a nice channel that allows marketers to share valuable content, but also include some plugs to check out the product for people that perhaps haven't checked it out yet.
Totally. And I think that's a really important part, which is to say, like, keyword driven content is not going away. It's not, I really am not a fan of when like there's these, everything's black or white, like cold outbound is dead, quote unquote, or their strategy is dead. Like none of them are dead. They're just, is it the most ROI efficient way of going about it today, or future proofing the brand? Is that the really where you want to place all your bets? And how I think you just described it is really smart, because especially now with, written content is like fairly easily, easy to replicate basically, and generate, just on a quote unquote surface level way. But these insights you're getting from like expert led, conversations, essentially, you can't replicate those from like an AI prompt.
an AI tool cannot replicate those. That's a great point, Eric. I think, especially now with the rise of AI tools and more marketing teams using AI to write their content, research like a podcast and interviews with your customers are more valuable than ever to make sure that your content sounds human and quotes real people and has insights from experts, like you said. And we also know that a lot of companies are getting penalized by Google's algorithms for using AI to write their content. So I know we don't write content for search engines, we write content for humans. At least that's our mentality at Fellow. But I think also in the eyes of search engines like Google, if you have original quotes and original content that comes from your podcast or your webinars, that in the eyes of Google, I think also looks organic. So you will be less likely to get penalized for AI generated content. So, as you know, I'm a big fan of media like podcasts, and a huge advocate that companies should do this.
Yeah, and one place I know that you also distribute it on is YouTube. How do you think about video in general in terms of this playbook fitting in, whether it's like the distribution from the podcast video, but also any other video strategy you have on YouTube or elsewhere? What have you seen from that?
Yeah. And I'll be completely transparent here, Eric. I think as a small and mighty team, we made a decision to focus more on LinkedIn recently because that's where we see our customers and people in our ICP interacting the most. I think YouTube is a channel we definitely have like in the kind of like on the backlog. Like we want to continue posting shorts there. We definitely do. But I guess like a piece of advice for smaller teams is you don't have to be everywhere at the same time if you feel like it's too much for your team's bandwidth. I know YouTube is a super powerful channel and I'm excited to explore it more in the future. But right now, I think our main focus as a social platform and also for sharing videos is LinkedIn.
Cool. Yeah, I very much agree with that, which is essentially like perfecting channel by channel before you try to be everywhere. You basically take it channel by channel to the point where you're posting consistently and you're getting the results you want from it consistently before you move on to the next channel.
Yeah. And I will give a shout out to Emily on our team because she's being super consistent on LinkedIn for the last 48 days since she started managing our LinkedIn accounts. So I'm excited to continue seeing the growth because we got a 30% increase in followers in only 48 days. So
amazing.
I'll keep you posted on that follower growth for the next months.
And how do you delineate between like Aiden's personal LinkedIn versus like the company, and like how do you look at the differences between those strategies, or any other thought leaders you have? You might have some other, SMEs at Fellow outside of Aiden that maybe you're doing this, playbook with as well. So how do you look at the personal profile strategy versus like the company profile?
Yeah. I think now more than ever, founder-led marketing is becoming super important. I don't know if you agree and if you see a lot of companies do this, especially because, look, Fellow is in a very competitive environment, right? There are a lot of tools that you can use to transcribe your meetings, to take meeting notes. But Fellow, of course, is like the all-in-one tool that brings all these features together. However, it's a very competitive space. So we also like to think of Aiden as this trust builder that by generating thought leadership content around leadership, meetings, productivity, people will perhaps be doing research about different tools. And then when they look at his profile and how much he cares about this problem, they'll think, you know what, these guys really care about this problem. Their product must be really good. And then they check out our product, right? So we do think of Aiden as a very important pillar of our content strategy. And lately, starting this year in 2024, he started posting very, very actively on LinkedIn. So the way we see his LinkedIn profile, to answer your question, is the goal there is to build Aiden's thought leadership and position him as an expert in the topic of meetings and meeting productivity. Whereas the Fellow LinkedIn page, I would say it's a mixture of that type of content from our Super Managers podcast, but also promoting some things that are happening in the company, like features that we release, webinars that we're hosting. So I think it's a mix of both like promotional content about the product, but also a lot of thought leadership as well.
Is Aiden getting help on his personal content for his LinkedIn? Like, are you all kind of powering some of the content that he's using, obviously extracted from the podcast, but then are you like helping tee up V1s of some of these posts, or like what's that, execution look like?
Yeah, well, a lot of it comes from the podcast, Eric. So a lot of takeaways from the podcast because he's the host,
Right.
like you mentioned before.
Yep.
He's writing his own LinkedIn posts. So
Cool.
whatever he thinks was like a great takeaway from a conversation, but your team at Hatch is helping us with the clips that he's sharing. So that has been like a huge, huge benefit for him and for the team.
Awesome. And so when you look at the sort of quote unquote ROI or success of this, obviously, Aiden and the rest of the team has like been fully bought into this methodology for a long time. So it was not necessarily that you had to come in and say like, we need to do this, and then you had to sort of change the direction of how everybody thought about this. But how do you continue to know that this is something to continue to invest in? Like, do you have self-reported attribution? Do you do any like win-loss analysis? Do you ask customers in some other ways? Like, because obviously a big challenge with this in general is when someone's listening to your podcast for 6 months, and then they go to Google when they're finally in market, they go to Google and they type in the brand name Fellow, or they just go direct. You are not able to, with digital touchpoint attribution, see that, oh, this person listened to our podcast for the last 6 months. And that's actually why we've got the trust and affinity and recognition with them. So how are you directionally capturing that as best as possible?
Yeah. So one thought that is coming to mind right now, Eric, is as a marketer, you can tell when your sales team gets excited about things, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with that one. Apart from like the attribution systems and everything, we have a weekly town hall at Fellow, weekly town hall meeting where every department shares updates and good news. And I can tell when people on the sales team get excited about certain things. So, for example, sometimes we share like, "Oh, this person is going to be a guest on the Super Managers podcast," as like a piece of great news. And then we get some people from the sales team say like, "Amazing! I'm going to share this with prospects," or "Oh, great! Like I think this will really resonate with these people." So one is that, right? Like the ROI of your content could also be like, how excited is your sales team to share it with like people who are already in the pipeline? But also attribution, for example, in sales calls. Like we do ask our sales team to let us know also, and we have systems also to tag us when someone mentions the podcast during a discovery call or during a sales call. And just like anecdotally, I get a lot of like Slack DMs and conversations from sales reps saying like, this prospect has listened to the podcast, or this prospect came through the podcast. So I think having that relationship or close communication with the sales team can help you understand if your content is generating opportunities for them, even if it's opportunities for conversations, right? Like if they get excited, like, oh, I'm going to send this to a customer, I'm going to send this to a prospect. Eric, we also have a Slack community that we started for the Super Managers podcast listeners. And yeah, it's really cool to see people join that community and let us know, for example, that because of the podcast, they're going to check out Fellow. Like that's something that happens often. Like they join the Slack community and they say, hey, I'm a Super Managers podcast listener, not a Fellow user yet, but I'm excited to check it out. So I think those like bits of qualitative data can also tell you a lot about like, is your content resonating with the right audience, and is the sales team excited about it? And I think for us, like the Slack community has been a really cool way to see who's listening to the podcast and is so excited about it that they want to join a community of listeners for that podcast,
which is very rare. That fact alone, that you have a community around a Slack community around the podcast, is literally direct attribution that the content is working. Because if that community is your buyers,
exactly. And people joining the community are people in our ICP, people that we care about, and not that we don't care about everyone, but people, like we're targeting the right audience, like executives at tech companies, people who we want to have in our network, and we want them to be aware about Fellow as a solution when the time comes. So yeah, those are some examples of qualitative data. And then we also, for example, ask when someone signs up for the product, where did you hear about us? And one of those options in the drop-down menu is podcast.
Yep.
So that's another easy way for marketers to attribute some of the ROI, because the reality is, Eric, not everyone is going to answer that where did you hear about us question.
Right.
And even if it's mandatory, like, I don't know how reliable it is sometimes.
Agreed.
Because people just select some random options sometimes, but I think it's a great way to also filter some data.
Yeah, directional insights on it. And yeah, that term podcast might be, maybe they heard Aiden on a podcast that he was a guest on or something like that. Or, maybe it's LinkedIn, but that LinkedIn was the content that's on LinkedIn that resonated came from the podcast. So all these things, it's an ecosystem of all these things working together. But I think the main point is that really, I think we can get a little bit too hung up sometimes in like, can we directly attribute every single lead to the podcast, to the newsletter, to what have you? And really, like, ROI step one is, this is the source material for all the other content, or most of the other content that's powering everything else. And then number two is, are we getting that anecdotal feedback that it's resonating? Like, that's really what you want to know is the content resonating? If it's resonating with your ICP, then it's going to work. But
and is it starting conversations for your sales team?
Exactly.
You did post something on LinkedIn recently that I really like. I like your take on this. I think your post was around choosing two paths for your podcast. Like, you can either want to become like the top listened podcast for management in the world, or you use your podcast as an avenue to, for example, nurture your customers by inviting them to be guests on your podcast. Is that right? Like what I got from your LinkedIn post?
That second point, there's a little more to that second one, but yes, that's exactly right. Like, I think having clarity around the goal of your content in general. So it can be your podcast, can be your social, can be your newsletter, video, but knowing what the goal is in the beginning, setting that correctly, because if you execute really well, but you execute on the wrong thing, it's not going to succeed. So you have to select this correct strategy in the beginning. And I see some folks be a little bit unsure on, are they trying to do one or the other or both of those? So for example, if you want to become a number one podcast in your category, you would likely make, and you will make, different decisions than if you're using it to help Aiden be seen as a thought leader in general in your market, not just in the podcast, not in the audio feed on Spotify and Apple, but in your market. And you'll make different decisions about what types of episodes you produce, who you have on as guests, what types of topics you cover, how that material then gets translated to social and newsletter and all these things. What type of marketing you do for the show versus for Aiden and the company in general. Like, all of those decisions are stemmed from that one thing. And so, yeah, I think, executing the correct strategy poorly will lead to better results than executing the wrong strategy perfectly. And so yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at a little bit with that post. Yeah,
that was a great post. I like that.
So yeah, in terms of increasing so you've got an audience TAM, essentially your total addressable market of like who could be in your audience at Fellow. How do you think about increasing that audience? What are the levers that you're pulling to like try and grow the LinkedIn followers, grow the podcast listeners, grow the newsletter subscribers? Like, there's kind of obviously a bunch of ways you could do that. You could just go, pure content, quantity and quality, and some sort of organic strategies, or you could also like do paid amplification of the content itself. So yeah, how do you think about like growing the audience? Because you've got content that's resonating. So now it's like, how can we get that in the eyes and ears of more people?
Yeah, your questions are even prompting some ideas that we're not doing yet. Like, oh yeah, we should get our listeners like promoting the podcast more. Like maybe even tell them like, hey, let's do more giveaways,
Hmm.
right? Like, I don't know, you just prompted some ideas. I think, Eric, like one of the most powerful things about podcasts is leveraging your guests' network, right? For growth. And I think that's why social sharing is so important and generating clips that they can share on their profiles as well. I think that podcast producers and hosts need to be very empathetic about the content that they post on social about their guests. Like, I have a friend here at Fellow, our director of engineering, Alexandra. She wrote a book, and her book is called Remote Engineering Management, by the way. And she goes on a lot of podcasts. And one day she sends me this clip that another podcast posted of her, and she said, "There's no way I'm gonna post this.
Mm.
Like, I don't like what I'm saying. Like, I look too zoomed
Such a great
in."
point.
Uh, right?
Yeah,
And I don't know, I'm going on a tangent here,
that's
but
a
I
good
think
one.
that being super empathetic with what will your guest want to share on socials, I think that's powerful, because then they'll share the clip, then they'll tell their network to listen to the podcast. You see it, right? With super managers, most of our guests, like, we're super careful about what content we pick, even the title of the episode. Like, I
Yep.
think, will this person like this title?
Yep.
Because sometimes they might not, right? So I think when they like all those things that you're doing, like picking the right thumbnails, picking the right video clips, the right title that they will share, it's super powerful. It's super powerful because we see guests with thousands and hundreds of thousands of followers share our podcast, and as you may know, right after that, we do see an increase in followers and an increase in listens because guests with a large following are sharing the podcast.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It's actually a very under talked about point,
Yeah.
which is like what actually does happen quite often with podcasts and with video series that have guests on them is after the episode and when the team publishes the episode, the guest does not share anything about their appearance on that. And for a lot of teams, that's actually a pretty important strategy that they're hoping will happen to get net new, followers, listeners, things like that. And to your point, a big reason for that is you don't get feedback from them usually on why they
Yeah.
didn't share it. So that it's hard to learn, but really
It could
usually,
be
yeah,
It could be as silly as, "Oh, I didn't like the thumbnail you
exactly.
used." Or
Exactly.
I was recently an MC for a conference in Vancouver, and the conference posted a photo of me that I didn't
Yeah.
like. So I
Yeah.
didn't share it, but I
Exactly.
emailed their marketing manager and I said, "Hey, could you make another graphic with another photo and I'll share that?" But most guests are not doing that. So I think that's like super underrated. And yeah, it's true. No, we don't talk about it often.
Agreed. Yeah, that it's either what moment you selected to highlight for their snippet or for the promo material you gave them, what picture, what thumbnail, what headshot, all
Yeah.
what
And
title, all of those things
yeah, I
matter.
think another underrated lever, Eric, is internal communication within their company. So recently, we had the chief design officer at Pepsi come to the Super Managers podcast. But what I did was I simply asked him, like, "Hey, who on your team manages internal communication at Pepsi, so I can like send them some resources to share with the team internally?" And think about how many employees a company like that could have, and like if the internal communication team actually shares the episode with everyone in the company, that's a huge lever. And I don't think we talk about that often. Like, we see large companies, like CTOs and executives of large companies, get a lot of listens on their episodes. And our
Yep.
theory internally is we think they're sharing that
Yep.
internally.
Yep. And that's another underrated talking point, because one of the best ways that large company executives are able to disseminate their ideas and information to their team is through external interviews that they do. Funny enough, because like a lot of teams that have thousands and thousands of employees, like it's hard for the internal comms team to like actually get information to them sometimes, but they're more compelled when it's like some interesting external like media interview, podcast, video, what have you. And so the team can actually get good info from the exec at that company from an external interview.
Yeah. Yeah, just as an anecdote, we just had someone on the show. You might have heard the episode from a company called Rippling. And I think Rippling just raised like a big round of funding. And I got in touch with their communications team, and now they're being super responsive, asking me like, "Hey, can you make us a clip of this specific section
Super
where
smart.
he talks about the company and
Yep.
the product?" Because that's what they want to share on their company profile, like the specific part where he talks about the product. And we're okay with that. We're going to create the clip for them.
Super smart. Super smart. And those are like, the things that don't scale, quote unquote. But those are the
Mm-hmm.
things that actually get the result that you want. And
Yeah.
I'll say the guest strategy isn't obviously the end all be all of like how you grow a show or grow a content series or things like that. But these things matter. And and part of it is big names. People will actually just come listen. They'll seek out interviews that person has done, and so they'll stumble on super managers because they're following somebody. They didn't see it on social or whatever. Maybe they typed it into the Apple or Spotify, the person's name, and then they found it. So the key is it still has to be really good content, because if that person comes and listens and they happen to be a manager and love the how Aiden led the discussion and the
Interviews.
format
Yeah.
of it and all of that, you've just now earned another subscriber,
Mhm.
just through that. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
love all that. And, yeah, I guess what I would say, as kind of wrapping up like the 95% sort of content playbook, and then we can move on to a case study. I'd love, to see if there's any companies like you love that are also doing this. Um, what would you say so you had a really wonderful situation that you chose and I'm sure selected, smartly, to join a company that believes in this. What would you say
Hmm.
to, a content leader, content
Hmm.
manager, head of marketing that isn't necessarily in that position and is trying to affect change, to be able to do some of these things at their company?
Yeah. I mean, speaking of case studies, just like talking about the largest companies in our space, like look at the content they're producing, right? Like HubSpot is really well known for this. Like they were creating tons and tons of content on their blog. They have this podcast network. Like, how do you think how do you think HubSpot is like top of mind for anyone who needs a software like that? It's because they're everywhere with all the content they produce. So I think also companies like Shopify, right? Like they care so much about their customers. They produce great content, great podcasts, great even like downloadable resources for their customers. So using case studies, I think of companies that have transcended over time
Mhm.
and that are still thought leaders after years and years of being around.
Mhm.
I think hopefully will help these marketers make a point for if we want to position ourselves as thought leaders and be around for years and years to come, we need to create great content. And Eric, I think that's something like you said that I was super lucky to have with Aiden as a CEO, because when he hired me, he did say like, this is a long-term play.
Mhm.
Like Fellow will be around for years and years. Like we want this company to succeed
Yep.
and to like be a big player in the productivity space. So
Yep.
I think that when the CEO knows that this is like, okay, a long-term play, let's do this, then it's perhaps easier to convince them to create content like this.
Yeah. And in some cases, like I hate to say it, it's actually impossible to change some situations. But I think to your point, like there are some that just haven't been given the information on like how this works or examples of how it works or why it's important for the future, or all of those things. And one way I would also kind of make the case is like, what's the alternative? Like, are we just going to
Mm-hmm.
keep trying to outspend everybody in, paid search and lead gen ads and things like that? Because I mean, like, literally look at the trends of that. It's getting more expensive, more competitive. There's more competitors in general. Everybody's fighting over the same people who are in market. So like what's the alternative we're going to do? Um, and I think that's another good way to approach it.
Yeah, and I think people don't buy like they used to anymore, right? Like we were talking about attribution earlier, and marketers, like we love to think that people see an ad and they convert immediately. But the reality is that they might have heard about your product through a podcast and then talk to a friend and then I don't know, saw a billboard if your company pays for billboards. And then one day they saw an ad on Facebook and they're like, oh, right, I was meaning to sign up for that product that my friend told me about. And that's when they do it. So that's one thing. And I think that, I mean, I hear so many marketers say that in 2024, network and like your network and word of mouth for products is so much more important. So I think that great content also enables that word of mouth.
And that word of mouth is not just happening, where it used to happen at events, like live events and trade shows and things like that. It's happening on social media. It's happening in Slack groups, Facebook groups.
Yeah. One example, Eric, because you were asking of a company that I think has done this really well, that I see all the time on my LinkedIn feed is Pocus. I think, do you know of them?
I don't.
Their CEO is super active on LinkedIn. I think her name is Alexa. And they're so active on LinkedIn. I think they're empowering every employee in the company to post about PLG, and I think they want to become leaders or thought leaders in the PLG space. So see, at Fellow, when our sales and growth teams were considering options for like, oh, we need a product to do this, our head of growth was like, we need Pocus. I'm like, why? And he's like, because I love their LinkedIn content. And see, like that's how it works these days. And I bet their acquisition stats or data didn't say that. It could have said like Google, because we Googled their name and signed up for their product.
Right.
But what's the reality? Our head of growth was a big fan of the CEO's content on LinkedIn. So that's why he went for that product.
Amazing. I'm gonna study them now. That's a cool one.
And one more I'll mention, it's a Canadian company called Clue. Their CEO is Jason Smith. I'm a big fan of Jason. He also posts a lot on LinkedIn, and he's such a kind human to everyone in the startup community in Canada. And I love what they're doing with marketing, because what they're doing now is they have this thing called the Compete Network, where Clue hosts a wide variety of podcasts for product marketers. So also very cool concept to build trust with your ICP.
And that's Clue with a K, right?
KLUE.
I think I've seen them. They're doing a good job. I didn't know what they do, but I've seen their stuff just coming through the feed and whatnot.
They have, I think, like a competitive intelligence product for product marketers. And just like we were talking about, like I love their content so much that I told Jason, like, don't worry, the moment I have this problem, Clue will be the first team that comes to mind.
Yep. And that's the thing, like winning before Google, and being on that short list, because most buyers will end up purchasing from some company that's already on their short list the day they decide they need to make a purchase. Even when they go find others when they're actively searching, usually they're still going to ultimately select one that was already top of mind for them on that short list. So yeah, this has been great, Manuela. Thank you.
So fun.
Thank you for the time.
Yes.
My last question for you is, just in general, if there's anything that comes to mind that we haven't covered yet on like what you're excited about with the future of content specifically for B2B, what trends are you like fascinated by, excited about, anything like that?
Yeah. One thing that has been a big learning for us at Fellow is how to leverage AI, right? I think every marketer right now might be worried or wondering like, okay, how is our team going to use AI to make our processes more efficient? I think one learning for me has been, you don't use AI necessarily to write your content. Like, for example, like I was saying earlier, Eric, Google rolled out some algorithms that said your content could be penalized if you use AI. So I don't see AI as a writer anymore, but more as a facilitator of personalization in your content and getting to understand your audience. So we use it a lot internally to perhaps like understand what our audience would care about. What are some things that this piece of content hasn't covered yet that someone in our audience would like to hear about? So I think the biggest trend that I'm seeing with the marketers that I'm speaking with and also listening is personalization through AI and an understanding of your audience by leveraging AI to understand what are some holes or missing pieces in your content.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's a lot of sort of people on both sides of the AI topic right now. Like, is it scary specifically for content and marketing? Like, is it going to replace some needs for actual human, experts in here? Or is it actually on the other side going to empower and help make marketers 10 times better than they used to be because now they've got sort of assistance at their disposal? I tend to
Yeah.
lean
Well,
towards that camp personally, but
I recently listened to an interview with Kieran Flanagan. He's a CMO at HubSpot. He was at Zapier and then moved back to HubSpot. And he was talking about personalization through AI. And I was listening to the things they are doing at Zapier with like AI and how like when someone signs up to the product and they know they're a marketer, they're using AI to, for example, create some personalized resources to send them. Like these are the SAPs you should be using. These are the integrations you should be using.
yep.
So that is the type of stuff that gets me really excited about AI. I think
Yes.
it can make us like super efficient in personalizing our content. And it doesn't have to be the top of funnel or the content to acquire customers. It could also be the content we send after a customer becomes a customer to help them be successful in the product.
Exactly. I mean, for example, you all have been producing super managers for quite some time. Like, there's very likely a absolutely perfect episode for one of your
Yeah,
prospects or customers or audience members at that moment in time that would be amazing for them to receive at that exact moment in time that they need it. But they don't know because it's in the archives and they don't know which one's which. But that's a perfect example of like
that is
how
cool.
you could use that. So amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Manuela. This has been great. I would highly
Thanks,
recommend,
Eric.
any managers out there who are looking to make their life a little more productive, go check out Fellow.app. And Manuela, anywhere else you want to point people to connect with you or, the company?
Yeah, I love LinkedIn to have conversations about marketing and what's going on in the space. So feel free to connect with me there and we'll continue the conversation. But thank you so much for having me, Eric. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you.